Right, on my phone it says live on Facebook in the top right hand corner.
Yeah, mine too. I think we're on.
Okay, yeah, it looks like we are. Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for our first Sunstone UK Fireside. Really glad that you could join us, and that goes for all the people that are joining us on the Zoom and watching this live on the Sunstone UK Facebook page. Really glad that we could have Peter Bleakley here to talk to us. I'm going to hand over to him in just a minute. Just to let you know, there are two ways that you can ask questions, because Peter's going to talk to us for a bit, and then we're going to have a bit of a question and answer session, hopefully. And so you can ask questions either on Zoom if you've gone through the Zoom link, or just put comments on the live feed on the Sunstone UK page. So, Peter, good to have you with us. I'm going to hand the time over to you now.
Awesome. Hi, my name is Peter Bleakley. I'm a British Latter-day Saint, and I'm going to be talking today for about half an hour about kind of the journey I've been on. In a way, you could summarize it as a journey from being a sort of apologist for the church, in a sense, to becoming a loyal opposition or a friendly critic. And that has stepped up recently with a podcast series I've just started called Christians versus Pharisees, choosing sides in the Mormon Civil War and how to fight for them. And it's obviously putting my head above the parapet, you could say, and has consequences. But what I'm going to do today is kind of talk about how I got there and what kind of a space I'm trying to stake out or protect within the Latter-day Saint community. Sunstone services a large community of Mormonism. We have people from the Community of Christ, as well as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints involved and watching, and other branches of the family as well, as it were. So welcome all of you. And I hope this is interesting or helpful or insightful, at least to understand where it is that people who are faithful, rooted in Mormonism, might become a faithful critic. Someone saying we've got problems and they need fixing, and how we can actually do that, and whether we should do that even, and how people respond to that. So my Mormon story really begins with my great-grandmother, Jeannie Simpson, who became Jeannie Bleakley. And she was converted to Mormonism in the 1920s. And she was invited by some missionaries to go and hear James Talmage, the apostle, speak. And at the time, he was acting president of the British Mission. And he really impressed her. And she basically said, I believe anything that man said. She joined the church. She was doing the British Empire bit, so then went home and spent the next several decades living in Ceylon, and was the only Mormon there. And she was supported in her faith, particularly with correspondence with John A. Widsoe and his wife Leah, who were very kind and generous towards her. Somewhat, I think, the Browns, Hugh B. Brown, who was president of the British Mission. She'd occasionally come home to visit Britain and feel that connection with the saints in Britain. And the Mormonism that she responded to was very pro-science. Talmage and these other great thinkers were scientists, they were intellectuals, they were academics, and that was the Mormonism that she connected with. Very hopeful, very positive about the future, unafraid of where the world was going, seeing Mormonism as part of the development of the modern world. My parents, her grandson David, my dad, and my mum Shirley, who was a convert to the church, met at Brigham Young University in Provo, and the British Saints students hung out there. They met each other, got married, had me. So I was born in Provo and came back to Britain when I was about 1.5. While they were there, they were good friends with Dave Irwin, who's now the London Temple president. So when I keep joking that he was nearly the David who was my dad, which would have been fabulous. But anyway, I'm very happy with the one I got. And when they came back to Britain, they came eventually to Tunbridge Wells branch in Kent in southeast England. Tiny little branch meeting in like the scuzziest rented community centre ever in history. A little group struggling on, all British converts, occasionally an American would come and move in. And as they arrived, the response to them announcing they'd just kind of come from BYU was, oh, good, we need a new branch president. And my parents were in leadership from that point onwards. And they were very much part of what we sometimes call the sacrificial generation. During the 60s and 1970s and into the 80s, these faithful Latter-day Saints just working constantly to build the church, to preserve these tiny little twigs and eventually, hopefully, have them spark up into becoming a ward and making that progress. And the advantage that my parents had was that they'd been at Brigham Young University for several years. So they had a vision of what the church could be, what it could become. And so they were able to kind of contribute that and do their little bit with all the others working hard to bring about this kind of creation of the church in Britain. After we had basically been rebooted when most of the early converts of the 1800s and since just went to America. So we were kind of beginning from scratch during that time. And my life has kind of followed that trajectory in really interesting ways as I reflect on it. A lot of those people burnt out. At the time, church demanded all of your time. It was midweek, it was primary was during the week in someone's house. You had several meetings on a Sunday. It was an intense, immersive experience of being in a very close-knit but demanding community. And leaders, particularly men, were often away from the home. The mindset that I grew up with in what Mormonism is and what our role in it is was absolutely crucial, I've realized, to me surviving challenges since. It was always this idea that the church is our responsibility. We make it, we love it, we are faithful to it, but sort of lunchtime on a Sunday was always then a massive critical analysis of, right, what went wrong today and how are we going to fix it? So I grew up with it being normal to constantly consider we are on a journey. We need to do better. Whatever didn't work today, what can we do to sort that out and do better tomorrow? And that worked with the Mormonism we were being taught religiously, that we're all on a journey of progression and improvement. And so that idea of having constant analysis of things not being perfect, but that's okay, we're on a journey, was really foundational to the upbringing I had in the church. And it meant I was able to differentiate between choices by leaders and what the real religion is, if you see what I mean, which turned out to be very helpful later. I was a real nerdy, very shy, sort of intellectual geek type. At that time, there was still a Church of England culture in the country. It was dying fast, but it was kind of there. And we were very conscious of being a persecuted people, or at least a misunderstood people. The way we lived was very different to the normal culture, which all revolved around the pub. And as a teenager, all my friends were about, you know, boozing and all of that and drugs, and that just wasn't what we did. So our experience was very much being outsiders, having to really be sure of why you're doing this. Why are you bothering? What is your religion? You couldn't just remain active in the church without thinking about it. You need to really have a reason to be going and to fight for it and make that stand, which in a way meant that our teenage rebellion, rather than being channeled in rebellion against church and gospel values, as it were, that by being an enthusiastic Latter-day Saint with its values, you were badass. You were being quite countercultural, you know. And there was an exhilaration about that in some ways. I was very conscious then of our place as Mormons in a larger, particularly Christian world. I got involved in the Christian Union at my secondary school and met for the first time and really interacted with just lovely British Christians, you know, this rare species, hardly any of either of us left, and started getting into discussing and understanding deep doctrines, with my peers at church. I had some great young men and women I was growing up with, and we loved all this stuff. We constantly talked about Mormon doctrine. We had the book Mormon Doctrine, had all the answers in it. Our parents had the journals of discourses on the shelf. This was the sort of not very correlated Mormonism of the past, where all kinds of wild ideas were going around. I decided to serve a mission. I was reaching Fowler's stage 3, so I was certain it all makes sense. I wasn't particularly spiritual, but the gospel had always made sense intellectually. And just as I came up serving my mission, I really started to have more spiritual experiences and kind of be like, oh, so that's what that is. Okay. And I kind of didn't need them till then. I was just worked things out in my head, I suppose. I got called to the Florida Tallahassee mission in the Bible Belt, which was North Florida, South Alabama, and 1 county each of Mississippi and Georgia, just to make it more southern. And it was a culture shock, and I loved it. It was incredible. Crazy, racist, segregated. We'd just come out of South Africa, getting over apartheid, and here I was going to go and live in America's apartheid South. And it was an incredible sort of experience from a sort of historical and social political point of view. I got involved in art projects. I'm an artist, so I ended up painting 2 huge murals in local schools, which was great, sort of a way to build up friendliness with the church in the area. One of the areas I served in, they hadn't told me this, but the previous missionaries got run out of town at gunpoint by a Pentecostal preacher. So, you know, we were building bridges and had a wonderful time there and experienced for the first time living in a completely Christian culture and all its dysfunctions, and very excited about how we'd kind of fixed a lot of that stuff. You know, if you imagine the worst tele-evangelists, multiply it by 10, and that's what's going on every corner, that's the Deep South evangelical religion for you in many ways. The experience of the Provo MTC was an interesting one. In part because a mission president who'd served in our mission and had been pushing his missionaries with the numbers game to just baptize like machines and not really care much about if people were converted, followed on from the baseball baptisms to fill up our ward lists with dead wood, basically, that were a huge burden. And guess who the MTC president was? It was him. And I was like, you are kidding me. The lunatic's taken over the asylum. But then I was like, no, he's safe here. There's no actual people being taught. It's great. And he's a great motivator. So that was interesting. But from that, I'm already seeing kind of this idea of dysfunctions of how things are run, how power is gained or exercised in the church, and thinking about it all. Just at the end of my mission, I discovered Sunstone magazine. I think I may have heard of it before my mission, I don't know. It was this sort of word in the ether, sunstone, shh, naughty. I was staying with a friend after my mission and went into Logan Library, and there are all these sunstones on the shelf. And I went mental with their photocopier. This is all before the internet. And brought home loads of articles and subscribed. And suddenly I was connected with this world I had no idea existed, of free thought and discussion about our church from a cultural perspective, political, critical analysis. And that became my lifeline, really, to kind of feed my brain as a Latter-day Saint from then on. I went to university in Chichester doing an art and related arts degree, and got very involved in the Christian Union there. And it was fascinating. This was a time where the British evangelicals were getting super excited about what they called the Toronto Blessing, which was a kind of manifestation of extreme speaking in tongues and miracles. And they felt this was going to be the new Christian revival, a bit like the Wesleyan revival of the 17 or 1800s that had converted Wales, you know, and they were super excited. So it was fascinating to see the best, the absolute best of young Christians in other churches champing at the bit to convert their country. And I learned a lot from it. First of all, I learned they need manuals. These people were totally disorganized. They were constantly reinventing the wheel. They wasted so much energy just deciding how to do church this week. And for the first time, I realized, I actually appreciated that these things that seem a bit imprisoning, our manuals, our handbook, are actually a huge strength, because anyone can pick them up and function. And I was seeing that all this energy, but really not achieving much because they just didn't have structure. So that was an interesting insight there. I learned that our religious deep stuff rocks. I had conversations with people there who are from Eastern religious traditions, and I was able to hold my own because of D&C 93, which is all about the philosophy of truth and light and the nature of intelligence. So I started to appreciate that our weirder stuff actually gives us a connection with the other world religions in ways that we don't usually appreciate within the Christian realm. And particularly the most profound and life-changing experience was my engagement with Steve, who was from a home. His parents ran a home church, evangelical, amazing, super spiritual, thoughtful, sincere, intense Christian, an art student a year above me. He was on the leadership committee of the Christian Union, and he was also the assistant to the Anglican chaplain on the campus. And after a year or so, an anti-cult campaigner did the tour of the local churches, and the Pentecostal other leaders of the Christian Union decided I was dangerous and asked me not to pray in meetings anymore. And I was really upset by this because I'd loved having that connection, and I'd always been involved in Christian Union at school. Steve was upset by this as well, because he was like, we're not a church, you can't excommunicate people. And this began Steve getting hold of every anti-Mormon book he could find anywhere ever, boxes of them, and investigating, can we really say Peter is not a Christian? And we engaged then in 2 years of hours-long conversations and dialogue. And this is what I've been preparing for. I didn't need any of this in the Bible Belt, but this is where all my nerdiness as a teenager kicked in. My salvation was the truth about the God makers, which was kind of the only resource to refute a lot of the anti-Mormon criticisms. Got it here somewhere. Again, before the internet, which kind of evolved eventually into Fair Mormon. And just discussing our weird stuff, just on all the difficult topics the anti-Mormon literature could come up with, we were discovering together how Mormonism has things to say about stuff that leaves a lot of mainstream Christianity behind. And Steve was really powerfully kind of intrigued by this. Then one weekend I got back and found him asleep on his sofa with his Book of Mormon with notes all over it, asleep, took a photo. And then later on, he's like, do you know what's in this book, Peter? And I was like, yes, Steve, I've been telling you for 2 years, you numpty. And he finally read the book, and that was it. He was converted. He suffered a lot for that. His family kicked him out. He ended up going on a mission to Ireland after I baptized him, which is possibly even worse than being evicted by your parents. That relationship healed later, though, which is lovely. His parents are lovely. But what that again taught me is how much treasure we have in Mormonism. Our doctrine is incredible. This was a peak moment. Everything was going great. Mormonism wins. I can convert the most amazing Christians you can throw at me, or rather God can and our ideas can. Our religion had become more welcoming. We stopped being racist, which was helpful. And our culture was welcoming. We could go to a youth convention and bring your non-member friends. And as long as they're not naked, it's great. And we have a good time and we can convert them. And we can be ourselves while being Mormons, was really the major message we were getting, that you can do both. You can have a win-win. You can have your own culture, your own clothing, your own teen culture. But over time, I also started to become aware of some of the dysfunctions we have that we needed to work on. I was starting to see how much professionals, adults who function in their workplace as managers and leaders were infantilized at church, limited in what they're allowed to say and do, constantly nervous about, can I actually do this idea? Silence when they needed to say, no, this plan we've heard 20 times before for doing missionary work or reactivating people doesn't work. It didn't work all the other times. It's not going to work. Shall we try something that might work? But no, that was shamed into silence. And over again, we just wasted time repeating the strategies that don't work. So that was an issue. The constant baptizing people too quickly without giving them time. My mum took 6 months to join the church and she's been amazing. her flatmate had to keep dragging the missionaries back. And the mission machine was only interested in people who never question anything, who just say yes quickly and will jump in a font. Occasionally missionaries would rebel and say, no, I'm continuing. But nearly all the time, their leaders and trainers were saying, don't bother with those people, they're not the elect, which is insane. So we filled our membership up with deadwood, people who weren't really converted or didn't know what they were doing, instead of taking the time to be the guide at the side of the people who would have been the keepers. The shaming we do of our children over normal experiences of puberty, that every young person, if they're honest in their interviews, gets locked into a shaming cycle, which is a cult control tactic to do with just being a human being with genitals. No common consent accountability, just always at the mercy of whatever 15 men think is God's will, without any filtering. Hostility to science. This science-friendly religion my ancestors embraced started to kick in. The September 6 intellectuals were excommunicated. Boyd K. Packer announced the enemies of the church are the intellectuals, the feminists, the homosexuals. I was an intellectual. My mum's a feminist. She was secretly subscribing to Exponent 2. She's so woke. While being State Relief Society president. My gay friends were, and who I'd served with on my mission, eventually had to drop out of church because it was not safe to stay. I have a list called Gays of Our Lives. It has about 20 people on it. People I grew up with, served missions with, taught as a youth leader, people I've served in bishoprics and things with. All of them, except 2 or 3, had to leave the church because it was not safe for them to stay. The church not dealing with evolution, still teaching in seminary that the world is 6,000 years old, which was a deal breaker for the brightest young man I ever taught in primary. That was one of the triggers for him to realize this place doesn't have truth, what's going on. And there began to be a few steps forward, but I started to experience this kind of temporary golden age or flourishing of the religion going backwards. Multiculturalism was embraced. We had that ensign with all the different races lined up, a bit like a Norman Rockwell illustration. Gordon B. Hinckley got a grip and said, we need to get back to basics doctrinally. We need to stop going off on these obscure flights of fancy. Let's focus on Christ, which was helpful, just to rein in some of the extremes, although in doing that, they ended up losing a lot as well, I think. We had the Mormon moments around Mitt Romney's presidential run, which triggered one of the greatest moments of my life in 2012, when the church, through President Newsroom, their President Newsroom, who knows who that is, but bless him. If it's you, Elder Otterson, we love you. Thank you. Disavowing racism, all racism in the church, past and present, which meant a lot to me after serving in the Deep South. And then the Gospel Topics essays, and then Rough Stone Rolling, true history coming through now. But with the difficult acknowledgement that all the stuff the anti-Mormons used to accuse us of, 80% of it was actually spot on all along, which the church is still not prepared to acknowledge entirely. The homophobia became entrenched. Prop 8, the Family Proclamation, and then the 2015 policy of exclusion in November 2015, barring any babies, children, teenagers who had a parent who had ever cohabited homosexually in its original wording in the handbook, were not going to be allowed to be baptized or named and blessed or set foot in our temple and contaminate it until they were an adult, moved out of their parents' home, disavowed their parents' relationship, and then begged the first presidency to be baptized. I think that was the moment that broke a lot of us, because it contradicts nearly all of the things Jesus taught. It contradicts the articles of faith about not being punished for your parents' transgressions, and just where until then our attitude had always been, doesn't matter what your home life is like, we'll love you, come and be Mormon, you're one of us. We will look after you, we'll compensate for whatever you might be lacking at home. And it was horrific. And then individual incidents of cruelty and lies. Elder Oaks and Ballard's face to face. Elder Ballard cheered me up. He'd said to the CES, we've got to teach true history. You've got to stop lying to the kids. Stop just telling them faith-promoting stories. Know the gospel topics like the back of your hand and teach them. But a year or two later, when it was his turn to step up in front of the youth of the whole church in his face-to-face, he lied. He did everything he told them not to. He bore his testimony at them. He swore to them that the leaders of the church had never hidden anything from anybody. And he did this holding the 1832 account of the first vision that Joseph Fielding Smith hid in his safe for 3 decades. And something broke in me at that point, because I now understood that our apostles could just lie. Like, just not by mistake, not misunderstanding stuff, not all silly old granddads. They intentionally just lie. And he told all of those young people to tell the same lie. If anyone asks any questions about all this church history nonsense, just tell them the leaders of the church never hid anything from anybody. It's all rubbish. The child safeguarding issue came up. Sam Young's Protect LDS Children campaign by an amazing catalogue of events. I and 2 others ended up appearing on the Victoria Derbyshire news show in the morning, advocating for his campaign. Brilliant, amazing experience. My first time really being a public vocal voice for reform in our church. They excommunicated him, then made some improvements to safeguarding him, children, but not enough. Then there were the talks, the 3 BYU talks. Elder Iring Jr. at Idaho, the Renlands at Hawaii, I think it was Corbridge at Provo. Manifestos for telling the young people never to question and not to think. That if you have any questions about anything to do with the church, have a guilt trip about your sins, feel better because you repented, you'll know everything's true. Don't even think about it. From Henry B. Iring Jr., president of BYU Idaho. The Renlands even had an animation mocking people with questions. Elder Corbridge, all these secondary issues don't matter. Just get a spiritual witness the Book of Mormon is true and everything else is true. When it is the secondary issues of Joseph Smith's life, what he did, that we build our testimonies on. And then the conference talks. Elder Iring, the power of sustaining faith. It is a sin you must repent of to speak or even think of your leaders of having human weakness. And he quoted George Q. Cannon, only God can judge them. In other words, diplomatic immunity for any form of leadership, spiritual priesthood abuse you want. You are not allowed to even think that your leaders are doing anything wrong, which is a catastrophe for child safeguarding or for common sense, really. But he taught that as a principle and said we should go through that process of repenting for that before every worthiness interview and every conference where we'll sustain leaders. President of the 70, F. Whitney Clayton, taught that real obedience is unconditional and in advance, after saying he wasn't teaching about unconditional obedience. Elder Anderson and others, your sustaining vote of the leaders is not them being held accountable to you, as it always was. It is now you making a covenant promise to unconditionally obey and support anything the leaders do or say. Dallin Oaks taught there is no loyal opposition in the church. In other words, you can't disagree with anything they say or do and consider yourself a faithful and loyal to the gospel of Jesus Christ and the restoration. He then, a few months later, went and spoke to our parliament and lectured them about tolerating diversity and religious freedom. The B1 event to celebrate 40 years since we stopped being racist. And Dallin Oaks got up and began with a grumpy granddad lecture saying, actually, it was God's idea after all to be racist. And he's recently expanded on that at length. His talk a couple of months ago at Brigham Young University called Racism and Other Challenges. He's expanded on that and absolutely doubled down that that it was always God's commandment to be racist. But we can't call it racism because it's God. So you can't call God a racist. So whatever he did and the church did isn't racism, even though it was racist segregation. That talk is extraordinary. It begins with him preaching powerfully against discrimination, but then by the end, that's just us, that you can't criticize the church. And that's all because he cannot allow himself to acknowledge that the leaders could ever make a mistake. So he's going that extreme to defend that position. So I'm now experiencing leaders of the church literally teaching Lucifer's plan of salvation as I've always been taught it. You obey, you don't think for yourself, you're not allowed to question, we will do your thinking for you. And there is no exceptions allowed, lockstep everyone. So what do you do? Well, a lot of people leave. My friends started leaving. They were just fed up with the lies, with the cultural damage, with the judgmentalism, the shaming, all of these things that cause people to lose their testimonies. I was able to hang in there a bit long, or still hang in there, because in a sense I'd grown up with this ability to differentiate between the leaders and what they're doing and what the real religion is. But I've realized I can't just ignore this anymore. And what has accelerated things is we are now at a very specific point of crisis. The stats were leaked recently for activity rates in Britain, which are usually highly secret. In the 10 years since the area presidency of Europe challenged Europe to double sacrament attendance, it has plummeted. We are down to now 15% on average, less than 15% of the Latter-day Saints on the records in Britain and Ireland active in the church. And it's similar across Europe and many other areas. We have the revelations that the church has been hoarding unbelievable wealth, investing our tithing in the stock market, using none of it to help the church. Over $100 billion in just the Ensign Peak Fund, which they kept so secret that most of the apostles didn't know about it. Boyd K. Packer, as president of the 12, asked how much money is in this fund, and he was told by the first presidency and the presiding bishopric who manage it that he was not allowed to know. Of course, they weren't feeling guilty, I'm sure, which changes everything regarding tithing. They can, just on the interest from that one fund, they can cover the entire budget of the church and have 2 billion left over to spend on more things or reinvest. And this, just understanding the leaders are not going to change by themselves. We keep hoping that a younger generation will come through, that there'll be baby steps. But what has actually happened is this particular version of Mormonism, which I call Pharisee Mormonism, has become the dominant mindset. It is the religion of the first presidency now, and they teach it. And you can't, everything about what I was raised to do and be is the opposite of what they are now teaching is the faithful path, the covenant path. And it harms so many people, and it's so elitist. It only works for a tiny percentage of people to marry in the temple, have all of their children marry the right people in the temple, all stay fully active unto the 4th generation. Like hardly anyone even manages that, but that's all they talk about now as a path for righteousness. The definition of Christianity, Jesus said, is what do you do and what do you say for the outcasts? How do you support the people on the fringes, the people for whom the easy life does not come easily? That is the definition of your Christianity. And we live in a culture that only wants to talk about the stereotype ideal, and everyone else is kind of something embarrassing you mention in private. And that's been an intentional pathway that Boyd K. Packer asked the leaders of the church to follow. When really it should be the reverse. Our whole religion should be about how do we treat the LGBTQ people. There are people in local areas pioneering doing this right. My stake is doing amazing things for child safeguarding, for LGBTQ inclusion, and some of our neighbouring stakes are as well. We can bring about change by initiating things locally and then having that spread. But the problem as I see it, and why I've started doing these podcasts and being much more intensely critical and vocal, is that that's not enough anymore and we have no time left. The church will cease to exist in Britain in the next 15 or 20 years. And a lot of us have already passed the point of losing too many of our young people to survive as a congregation once the elderly die. The church's own stats from years ago was that 80% of our young people leave the church by the time they're 30. And it's a higher percentage now. So every person I look at church, I kind of see now as a dead testimony walking. At some point, they or their children are going to uncover all of this knowledge on the internet, which is always just a click away, about these corruptions, about the problems, about how much we've been lied to about our history. And so you can't, my view, and the view that Elder Ballard talked when he said to everyone years ago to follow, is we've got to inoculate people. They need to hear it first from us at church, and we need to help people to process that. And we still haven't done that in pretty much every way. What's the strategy? The Bloggernacle is a brains trust. Talk to the people who left. They'll tell you how to fix the church. They'll tell you why they had to go, why they could have stayed, and what that would take. And that's what I'm trying to communicate with these podcasts particularly. We can reform the whole worthiness culture. Young people want community and purpose. We can offer them community, we can offer them purpose, but they are not going to touch with a barge pole an organization that is anyway sexist, racist, or homophobic and transphobic. And if our church is the last organization on earth in their lives tolerating or practicing those things, they are not going to stay in our church. And that is the ultimate reality we all have to face. We are going to have to ordain women. We are going to have LGBTQ equality. It'll be painful and difficult, but there is no other way. And we just have to get on with working towards that. But Dallin Oaks has a plan. He's the next prophet. He's already laid out his plan to fight all of those things intensively. So whether we like it or not, if we're going to keep our children in this church, we have to engage in this struggle for the soul of our religion. We have to engage in the civil war. We need to take back power. The scriptures give us the common consent authority to authorize and screen anything the leaders present or declare as a revelation. But they are fighting back. They've added disagreeing with policies of the church to adding to disagreeing with doctrine as a definition of apostasy in the new handbook, which also threw in for good measure that we should all take the sacrament with our right hands. So we are not in neutral territory anymore. We are not slowly progressing as a church. That's not happening. We were for a bit, but we need to understand that the clear plan, clearly communicated, of our current senior leadership is to go back to the future and to undo most of that progress. So whether you like it or not, you are going to have to at some point engage in this civil war. And this is what I'm trying to do. It comes at a cost. It upsets people. It means I may well be excommunicated. I hope I'm not, but that is, of course, a clear and present danger. But I've had to make peace with that in order to do what I feel, for me at least, is the right thing to do, to begin this conversation, or it's not to begin, it's been going on for ages, to contribute to it, to encourage us to start having these conversations, because I can't stand anymore watching another family leave the church when they don't need to, when they're leaving because of the things the church taught them. They're leaving not in rebellion against the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Book of Mormon, or the scriptures, or the principles of our religion. They're leaving because those same principles are being violated egregiously, shamelessly, relentlessly, and they cannot stay with integrity. And that is the tragic reality that we all have to face up to fast. And we need to deserve to have them back and to keep them. The problem is with us. It is not the world attacking us. We've done this to ourselves. And I'm creating a space for the fact that there's so much good in our religion. We have Christian Mormonism, wonderful, but all the time it's being battered and often defeated by the Pharisee religion that unfortunately is very much in the ascendancy. So that's my kind of big picture analysis. That's where I'm at. That is what I'm challenging people to consider engaging with. And we'll see how it goes. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. We'll be happy to take questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Really appreciate you doing that. I know it's not easy to kind of condense the huge amount of material that you've been producing recently into such a short space of time. And for those of you that haven't come across the I don't know what to call them. Do I call them podcasts? That Peter's done, then can I encourage you to do that? If you look on the Sunstone UK page, there's a link on the post that Peter put on there today that put you onto his YouTube channel where you can view those. So I'd really encourage you to do that. Okay, so we've got some questions for you now. Can I, before I ask the first question, I'll try and ask them in the order in which they came to me. Can I just remind you again, those people that are watching, if you want to ask a question, there are two ways that you can do that, either through the question and answer function on Zoom, if you're joining us through Zoom, or on the comments on the Facebook page. So, first question for you, Peter. So, I'll read it exactly as it is, as it's been put by the author. It says, Peter talked about a past church which was exciting and full of possibilities. What does he think are the possibilities for the future in the UK so that we can regain that excitement?
I'm working up to episode 7, which will be all about the good stuff after the quite a few, in a sense, critical analyses. So I'll be piling a lot of stuff into that. I think I'll talk about specific UK in a minute, but part of it would be general positivity anyway. We have a religion that should be absolutely winning the 21st century. But because of the intense, often by highly uneducated people, Pharisee focus on not engaging with the modern world, we've ended up with a religion that's hostile to science, that has all these issues. But original Mormonism has scriptures about learning from the best books about everything. It is totally pro-education. It is all about embracing what we can learn from science, from other religions. Even Brigham Young, some amazing quotes about absorbing all knowledge into our religion, that we should be a sponge, that we should, so just having that mindset of being able to connect with other people, learn from them, as well as sharing what we have. So that mental attitude should be much more open and hopeful rather than scared of the world. We should be the most feminist Christians walking the earth today. We have a female God, for goodness sake. Eve is the hero of the Garden of Eden, according to actually Genesis, but also the endowment and Mormon scriptures. She is the first avatar of Christ. She chose to become mortal in order to save and exalt mankind. She chose to seek knowledge over comfort, whatever, even if it would kill her, which is powerful. She was decisive. She took action. These are all attributes usually associated with men in our culture, being a dynamic leader, an innovator, an actor. She is our hero. The history of the Christian world's and Judeo-Christian Islamic world's biblical-based hostility to women has been based on how she was presented traditionally in the Garden of Eden story, and representing all women being weak, tempestuous, and dangerous, and not able to be responsible with power. Mormonism flipped that script entirely by saying that the fall was a fall upwards, a conscious choice, and it was made by a woman. We should be the most feminist religion ever. And the fact that we're one of the least feminist Christians groups at the moment is just shameful, but we can turn that around. The Book of Mormon is often seen as racist because it established at the beginning a kind of a divine curse based on dark skin. But keep reading. The Book of Mormon is an anti-racist polemic. The brown people win. The white supremacists totally destroy themselves. They lose all credibility because of their hatred, and they lose their souls and they lose their civilization. And ultimately, it's a powerful anti-white supremacist book. It's the brown people who inherit the covenants. So all of these kind of key social issues of the modern age, we should be all over that, not being the last to catch up, which is the usual. And our leaders are still that backward because they completely conflate being backward-looking, socially conservative, white American old men with God's will and how God sees everything. And our scriptures are the opposite, so we need to free ourselves from that nonsense. We have our scriptures say that actually there's a little verse in the Book of Mormon that God has spoken to every nation, kindred, and tongue, including the non-Israelites. It says, you know, the children of Israel, wherever they've scattered, but also the rest. So technically, we can engage with all the other religions and their scriptures and what we can learn from them. The Book of Mormon says that, and the Book of Mormon's message is one of global inclusion. It's not just about this one little tribe in the Middle East that matters to God. Well, there's so much multicultural, global vision there as fundamental principles in our religion. We are not meant to be parochial and stuck in the mountains somewhere. I think in Britain, I'm trying to, in a way, embody the best of British revolution. We're Bolshoi. We don't suffer fools gladly. If our political leaders get a bit above themselves or talk rubbish, we will turn on them like that. They're gone. There's no, you know, we'll criticize them. We'll tell it how it is. We'll swear about them in the pub. The only reason our monarchy has survived is they've learnt to not show off, even though it looks like they're showing off. They have to be super humble. And our thought about them has to be, oh, they're really working hard and serving us, even when the cameras are off and someone's bringing them a champagne. And I think the part of the reason we've tolerated such a terrible behavior from our general authorities and arrogance for so long, unquestioned, unchallenged, is both that culture of deference within the church, but I think it is also an American culture. There's a real kind of bamboozlement about people who are powerful and rich that is respected. American culture is about, you can show off if you're successful or in charge, and other people will respect you for that. Like, oh, well done being successful. In Britain, it's like, no, shut up, stop getting over yourself. Who do you think you are? And I think just that instinct to not put up with rubbish, not put up with pompous, arrogant people who actually don't know what they're talking about or are contradicting themselves or are talking nonsense. We have that streak within us to be like, no, you're not impressing me right now. Are you kidding? And ultimately, if we are in a sense going to topple an oligarchy, which is what this is about in however way we do it, whether just as in our heads declare independence and hold on to our religion regardless of how the leaders behave when they're behaving badly, we've got the rebel streak to do it, you know, just in how Britons react to people with authority and power. I would say finally and we've learned to really care about our religion. We don't slip into it easily here. You have to really want to be Mormon if you're going to be Mormon. And we're also, we get a lot of experience. The church internationally, where you haven't got huge wards, everyone gets to serve in leadership callings that are significant. And there's a real sort of loss of that experience in the large Utah wards where people don't get that experience and they feel their talents are being wasted, and they are. So I think maybe the model of how we experience church could be something we could offer the American heartlands. Maybe they need to have small awards where everyone does get to do something significant rather than just be bums on seats, because that has made our people much stronger in lots of ways. And just, sorry, one more thing. My mantra is Dieter Uchtdorf's talk. It works wonderfully. It was given in 2015 before they demoted him for it. And he said in that he gets it. You know, I'm not making this up. He said, we have a problem in our church. We have created a mountain of sediments, you know, the metaphor he used, of man-made good ideas, you know, things that seem to be a good idea. Let's do that. Programs, good expectations of our members. But when we should have then got rid of them, we didn't. We've piled them up. every member of the church is carrying around this huge burden of all the 1,000 things you didn't do today that you should have done to be a good Mormon. You didn't study the scriptures long enough. You didn't write your journal. You didn't sort your food storage out. You didn't do your home teaching. You didn't phone that person. You aren't developing your talents. You haven't. And he said it's crushing the flower of the gospel, the real gospel. So he got up there and he said it. He said, we have a Pharisee problem. The Pharisees add rules and rules and rules and expectations to control you and try to make you good. And it doesn't work. You have to trust people to govern themselves. And he pleaded with the leaders of the church to take these burdens off and to stop adding to them. But the leadership of the church has decided to go with adding more burdens. We're now meant to take the sacrament with our right hand. You can't even oppose a policy or you're an apostate. Burden, burden, burden. If we can flip that script again, there's so much hope. We can just unburden ourselves of this weight that we're all carrying around. I'll stop now. Go on.
No, that's great. Thank you. Okay, next question. So, sorry, just lost it. Okay, here we go. As a UK church attending Latter-day Saint who loves the church and wants to see it thrive, I see you as someone trying to build the church up. Do you ever feel your intentions in speaking about the issues you do are misunderstood by some church members? In a sentence, what do you... if you can manage that, Peter, in a sentence, what would you say is your motivation for speaking out as you do?
My nieces, my nephew, my cousins, my generation have lost most of our kids. Our parents' generation have lost most of their kids. I do not want it to happen to the next generation. And there isn't even going to be much generation because most of them have already gone to even have those kids. That is it. We cannot keep repeating the same mistake. And it means upsetting people. It means them thinking I'm an apostate, heretic apostate. And how dare I criticize the leaders? That's like criticizing God. Because they're, in most people's minds in the church who are still active, there's no differentiation. But also the inevitability of the doom. I go and visit wards or meet up with people my age or my parents' age who I've known for years all my life, and a lot of these old faithfuls are still there. It's incredible. And I say, how are you doing? And it's the same conversation. How are you doing? Oh, I'm doing fine, all good. How are your children? The people I grew up with. Oh, they're amazing. They're doing so well. They've married well. Their kids are incredible. They're doing really well in their careers. They don't come to church anymore. 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 It's apocalypse. And they're shell-shocked because they were all promised. They were promised since the 1960s and 70s. If you serve in your callings and leave your family for hours every week, if you do family home evening, if you do your scripture study, if you get your temple recommend and keep it, they're promised, you will have this progeny in the church. You will get the joy of seeing your children grow up in the gospel, and you'll be with them in heaven, and your grandchildren. And that, for in nearly every case, that is gone, or it's about to go. And we're about to do it to the third generation. I can't stand it. I cannot stand it. We can't just not say or do anything different, because it's too late anyway, almost in most congregations. The kids have already gone, but there's no time left. These changes have to come fast. They need to be now. People do need to be shocked out of their complacency. So I've chosen to be the fall guy to do that in my situation as best I see it, which can sound arrogant, but it was the church that taught me to be a savior in Mount Zion of everyone. So if I have a Messiah complex, it's because I'm a Mormon, and we all do. We all have this responsibility not to just sleepwalk over a cliff, which is what is mostly happening. So that's why I'm shaking it up.
Okay, I think this next question follows on quite well from that. This is a question and a statement, really. It says, why is it so hard for us to talk about these things in our LDS congregations? It feels as though the church would prefer that anyone with questions just leave quietly and never come back, rather than stay and ever mention anything that could be perceived as remotely critical.
Because that is exactly what the leaders want. That's why. That's what they teach. That's what they value, and they demonize literally anything else. And particularly, it's, you know, everyone's been trained with a script. If someone says something that makes you uncomfortable, that's challenging your paradigm, that's saying, well, actually, that isn't true. That thing about our church history is not accurate. And they've been telling you this since the Gospel Topics essays were published in 2013, 2013. Why have you not read them? Why am I being punished and shamed in Gospel Doctrine for knowing the stuff you were meant to have read 10 years ago, and that the leaders were told to get you educated about, but they haven't. They've been scared. And they've not, and it's all down to leadership. They've been very specifically encouraged not to do that. And the curriculum for the adults is still mostly ignoring that new history. They're doing better at teaching to the kids, but it's still very, very clear that they do not want the adults to find out how much they were lied to. And instead of providing a pastoral pathway to cope with that, to face up to that truth, because we were lied to a lot, but still they're choosing the lies. It's cowardice, cowardice, cowardice. They keep chickening out of actually doing the thing that needs doing. And this was shown again just in the last conference. Elder Cook, you know, our history of racism is meant to be their big theme at the moment, rooting out racism from the church. They're trying to impress the NAACP, who they've kind of formed a tentative alliance with. But Elder Cook got up and he taught a version of our history that completely erased our racist history. He said that when the Mormons went to Utah, it was all sweetness and light because our scriptures tell us not to be racist. And he quoted one random example of a family being nice to Indians and just talked about harmony. The reality is when they arrived there, they had slaves with them. Brigham Young, when the Utah Territory was created, gave a massive speech at the Utah legislature saying, we will be a slave state, which they didn't need to be. You know, slavery will be legal in our state because it's God's will. And he went on to say that interracial marriage was so appalling that anyone who married interracially should both be beheaded and their children. Their heads should be cut off. And that was in 1852 when he absolutely finalized, we are not ever going to ordain black people until every white person at the end during the millennium has had the opportunity to have the priesthood first. And black men and women will not set foot in our temple. And even though black people had already been ordained up to that point. That was the real history. And Utah was racially segregated until well into the civil rights era. They massacred Native Americans. At times they were nice to them, but there were massacres of the Timpanogos and Indians by Mormons, which killed hundreds. They literally enslaved Native American people. The Mormons did, enslaved men, women, and children, hundreds of them, if you learn the real history of Utah. And they tried to blame them for the Mountain Meadows massacre. And then they did the Indian placement program, and President Kimball promised that their children's skin would turn white and the Lamanite curse would be lifted. Oh, but no. If you go and look at Elder Cook's talk, October 29, 2020, none of it. So that is just a very clear signal that these people at the top are not going to change, and they're actually now reversing, they're backtracking from the Gospel Topics essays. The trajectory is in reverse, assertively. So they are not going in the right direction to save our church. We are going to have to challenge them to stop lying. Yeah, I'll stop now. Go on.
That's great. It's really interesting. I think because we are, we're brought up to answer in Sunday school and priesthood and everything else to answer with these kind of set cliche answers of read your scriptures, say your prayers. It's very easy for us to detect as soon as somebody kind of goes off the script, you know, and those alarm bells go off. And
as a teacher, the level of thought and education there. That's elementary level analysis. And what happens is we kid adults that they're learning. We keep repeating this curriculum. We scroll through the scriptures. The same questions get asked. The same answers are given. And that's it. Everyone knows the script. And there's been no actual learning for years and years, unless you have a particularly good teacher who's willing to go off the manual and actually teach. And there's an intentional dumbing down now of the curriculum. The Come Follow Me curriculum has been reduced to the child level of depth. It's about proof texting. It is no longer, here are the scriptures, let's expose ourselves to everything they offer, we might learn something new. Everything is framed as, these are the 3 things the general authority has decided it's safe for you to know about these passages. And they often leave out the juicy bits, you know, again, completely ignoring polygamy most of the time and such like that. And so it's, again, then it's an intentional infantilization. And I try to understand the people who are locked into it, this feedback loop. And it's just soothing, it's comforting. The people who that supports are the people who just in a crazy, difficult world want to go and have a bit of peace and quiet at church. They want to hear the same rhythms. It's a bit like the Catholics, you know, they want to hear the Latin Mass, just the sounds of their childhood echoing around, be reassured that everything is fine, everything's very simple, easy answers to stuff. We know it. It's just to get that sort of, it's like, you know, a meditation or something. But they're not being educated. They're not. To learn something, you have to have your previous assumptions challenged, and you have to learn something you didn't know before. That's education. And so grown adults are kept trapped in elementary level knowledge because it's psychologically soothing. But ultimately, these people are not the growth of the church. They're not great missionaries. They just want to repeat the rituals. And the thing that really aggravates me is we watched the Church of England do this to itself. My child, you know, the C of E, throughout my childhood, was still kind of quite dominant in society. They had big congregations, but over and over again, they made the choice not to modernize, not to be relevant to their young people, but to always pander to the older generation who were reliable and would turn up and do the flowers and pay the dues. So they got to always have their way. The young people left, then the old people died, empty church. The Church of England has been decimated. Their average attendance at church now is 27. The average C of E, and after COVID, that's expected to be annihilated. You know, there's newspaper articles about that now. And I watched them do that throughout my childhood, like, we must never do that. Thank goodness we'll never do that. We're doing it. And Richard Bushman, who wrote Rough Stone Rolling, famously said in a fireside, describing this process, he said, the leaders of the church have chosen to prioritize the grandmothers of San Pete County, which is sort of in southern Utah somewhere, over their grandchildren. And that is a strategy with an extremely short time limit, because when they're dead, so is your ward, they're gone. So we have to break this. And ultimately, ward and state leaders are going to have to step up and do what they were told to do 7 years ago and teach their people the gospel topics essays and make that central. Because I've had bruising experiences over the last few weeks in Sunday school lessons where I've been trying to teach the actual history or introduce some of it, and not even the difficult stuff. Like, seriously, they have no idea how much I'm holding back, in a sense. And it has gone down like a lead balloon and upset people. And we can't keep doing this to our members. We can't keep punishing the people who do due diligence. We can't keep punishing the people who are speaking the truth. They can't be the ones who have to hang their heads in shame. It's suicidal. But so ultimately, leaders are going to have to step up and make that change happen, because it's not happening by itself. What happens is the people who try that just get fed up. They can't, it's painful to attend any lesson, so they stop going because it's just too awful. It's like walking on glass, and we've got to stop doing that to people.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, got loads of questions, so we're gonna
sorry, I'll try and be quicker.
get on to another one.
Yeah.
So this is one from Facebook. It says, how would you revamp the missionary program?
Yeah, this is very dear to my heart because I loved my mission. I've been ward mission leader 3 times. So I hope people can accept I know what I'm talking about here. We have to take a long-term view. Other churches will not baptize you until you've been attending for months. They want to make sure you're absolutely rooted. This race to the font has got to stop because it's ridiculous. We need people to beg us for baptism, not the other way around. And again, flip that script. So for a start, no numerical target setting, because immediately that creates missionaries doing unethical things to manipulate someone's natural conversion process. There have been some moves recently. They've just told them to ignore the target setting chapter in Preach My Gospel, and that has got better. That lies told about it. Elder Ballard saying a little while ago, oh, we don't know where the missionaries got this idea that they should baptize people in 2 weeks. It's like, well, you told it to us. My first zone conference on my mission was Elder Holland coming and bullying the Florida Tallahassee mission because our targets weren't high enough. And he dragged all the district leaders and zone leaders up the front, made them double their already inflated targets, and basically told us all off for being lazy, none of which were achieved. You know, it's completely demoralizing experience. To his credit, the member of the 70 who was with him came back a few months later and did the opposite, told us, you're doing great, we're proud of you, do what you can, you know. So the target setting has to go. The idea of rushing people to baptism has to be over with. It has to be, we embed people, we're absolutely sure they're integrated socially into our ward and that they can make the changes required to be a long-term member, and then they will ask us if they want to be baptized. The other thing I think is that the whole way the missionaries work is designed to avoid middle-class families. It's completely self-sabotaging. You know, the holy grail of the missionaries, everything they do is against that. So they've got, again, a bit more flexibility now, but they were told to stay indoors studying for hours every morning because, you know, obviously they've completely forgotten their whole religion overnight, and then emerge blinking into the daylight when everyone with a job is in work. So the only people they will meet are people with difficult work patterns that won't fit with coming to church on Sunday, or unemployed or struggling. And that's who they baptize for years, of course. And there's nothing wrong with those people, but if they're the only people, it's not balanced. They need to get out at the crack of dawn when people are going to work. They need to encounter them. The Jehovah's Witnesses are playing a blinder right now. They just stand there. They don't harass people. They just literally stand there in the morning during rush hour by the station, and people go and talk to them. Wow, you know, things like that. But also, I think one of the most amazing reforms would be to have different Preach My Gospels for different people. Have one if you're teaching a Hindu. Have one if you're teaching an atheist. Have one if you are teaching an intellectual, someone who's educated. 40% of the people in Britain go to university now. And the way that Preach My Gospel is configured and taught is like spoon feeding children too much still. We have, but it does require being confident about our weird adoptions. The calculation that was made by the usual people thinking they know what they're doing in the office building was, we'll stop starting our missionary dialogues with people with big stuff like God, plan of salvation, what's your purpose in life. We'll just go straight to the restoration. We'll go straight to trying to make people care about something that happened as an internal spat in Christianity in the Middle Ages and why it was necessary for Joseph Smith to restore the gospel. And their calculation, tail wagging the dog thinking as usual, is, well, people have to accept that anyway if they're really going to go for Mormonism. So let's not waste time because we're always in a hurry. We'll just put that up front. It's like a filter. Anyone who can't cope with that, we've got rid of them immediately. We're not wasting our missionaries' time. Absolutely barking mad. Start with where people are. And I always think, if someone was going to convert me, what will it take? So let's write a Preach My Gospel for each of those scenarios. Get the members writing them. For me, I'm really interested in this idea that you can progress and become like God and have your own planet. You know, the thing we're meant to be most ashamed of, we're living in the Hubble world. Everyone who's vaguely awake and watched some documentaries knows there are 2 trillion galaxies in our visible universe. And each of those has 350 billion, that's almost as much money as the church, has 350 billion solar systems, many of which could support life. Our religion has already filled that universe with gods. Your destiny is in the stars. We have the Star Trek religion. Start with that first discussion. Your potential, because this is the zeitgeist of the modern age. Your personal, individual ability, unique gifts, potential, society's potential to progress and grow. We're at that point, and our religion talks about that, whereas almost all the rest of Christianity is about you are passive. You screwed up. Adam and Eve messed everything up for you. God's really angry with you. Just wait around for maybe Jesus will save you if you're lucky, and then spend the rest of your religious life thanking him for that. We have a completely modern, self-actualizing, proactive, ambitious, human potential, accomplishing religion. Make that the first discussion. So preach my gospels that actually match people's interests. Yeah.
I would have really enjoyed having you as my missionary companion. I think we could have had some really interesting times. Okay, next question. This is from Dougie Stilgo.
Hey, Doug.
So for those of us who have been forced out, as I have, and it has been made clear we are not welcome in the church we love, how can we continue to try and engage in an effective way?
This is hard, and I'm really about to enter that world because I know I've put my head above the parapet big time, and the vultures are circling. So this could well happen to me soon. I don't want it to, but it's, usually the test of can the church cope with a loyal opposition? The answer is no, of course not. So we keep trying though. I would say that the internet has broken down all kinds of boundaries and created fuzzy shared space. The old school idea that you're either in the church or you've left and you're a hostile apostate and never the twain shall meet is over with long ago. There are huge communities online where active and struggling and nuanced and post-Mormons meet, discuss freely, share ideas, are very concerned about the progress of the church. Even if they've left, it is their tribe, it's their culture, it is their world. They care still. They haven't become monsters. And in many cases, they still have dear friends and family members who are still actively involved in the church. So everything the church does and says and what it teaches these people is fundamentally important to them. So you can just be part of those communities online, engage in the conversation. A lot of people who have been forced out or left still post on Facebook and so on. Obviously, we all understand that mainstream members will often just switch off from that or disconnect because they find it distasteful or they feel offended by its existence, even though they will then flood Facebook with all of their pro-Mormon propaganda, so it's completely hypocritical. You endlessly hear about these stories of people who are dissident or have left, where their active member family and friends say, what are you doing to putting this in my space? How dare you? And then their prophet tells them to spend 7 days with a hashtag spamming them every day with stuff. We've got to stop that hypocrisy from within the church. And again, that idea of people, oh, you've left the church, but you can't leave it alone. I mean, that's ridiculous. We refuse to leave alone the people who left the church. We're always knocking on their doors. We're trying to get them back, sending them messages and so on. But if they do that, somehow that's completely outrageous, So the attitude within the church has just got to grow up a bit and stop being hypocritical on that issue. But I definitely think social media has opened up extraordinary possibilities for even outside for influencing change, and it's worked. The church only changed or improved in any way its safeguarding procedures for children because of Sam Young's campaign, and they excommunicated him, but it still had impact. And it got support from members and people who have left as well, coming together to apply that pressure to the leadership to have some common sense. Kate Kelly's campaign with ordained women, pleading with the leadership of the church to at least ask God, like do their jobs and pray about ordaining women. They excommunicated her, but it got a lot of publicity. It shamed the church. They've completely changed their language now about women and priesthood. They immediately suddenly had a woman giving a prayer in general conference. And so even if you end up kind of being the sacrificial lamb, the martyr, you can still have huge influence just by, because it's a Mormon concept. Truth prevails. Truth prevails. You cannot hide, you can't suppress a good idea. It will resonate with people, and it doesn't matter who's saying it. Truth is truth, or common sense, or a good idea. It spreads. So I would say, yeah, social media is the way.
Well, yeah, absolutely. The next question is a statement, not a question, but it links on really. I mean, it links on really well with what you've been saying there. It just says it would be a travesty if you were to be excommunicated. I would echo that that statement, but I think it's a really interesting idea, because as far as I'm concerned, if that happens, it just goes to prove everything that you've just been saying. That's the proof, isn't it? That's the evidence that we now have a leadership that just will not tolerate anyone that is prepared to question.
Well, but we know that anyway. I would just say they've already proven that enough. You know, you don't need to excommunicate me as well.
I know.
Everyone knows
Peter,
you think this.
I know, but I just want to say it now to almost put them off doing it.
Yeah. Oh no.
If you do it, you're just proving that we're that
well,
what
it
we're saying
does.
here is right.
It does. And then the follow-up thought is, well, you've had your moment. Now that you're an ex-Mormon, you know, no one will listen to you now. You'll lose your influence, Peter. I think with the way social media is, as I've said, well, no. And it's totally Obi-Wan. You know, if you strike me down, I will become more powerful than you can possibly imagine. And some people will use that power to become very hostile to the church or quite critical. I've had to, you know, think seriously about this. What would I actually do if I'm simply not welcome at church anymore? Why bother with these people who don't want to save themselves? You know, let them just fizzle out. They'll be gone in 15 years anyway. It'd be a sad memory, and we'll sell the building. We're, you know, like literally, in a way, it's almost like having it easy, because vindication is imminent, you know. And what I say to people sitting in the High Council around the table, if I was, you know, on trial in a court of love, first of all, I'd say, well, how many of your kids are still active then? Why is it that you think what I'm saying is a threat to their testimony, when everything you and the entire church and all the prophets and apostles have done and said to those kids has not kept them? You think I'm the problem, you know, first of all. And then it will be the way, you know, look at the stats. All the stakes in our area lost 1 in 4 of their active members over the last 10 years. You only need to have that happen one more time, and you will not be able to come back. Because what you lose is the kids who would then have the children, the kids who would be the missionaries. We are now already, we've had our mission closed down. The England, London, South mission is gone because there's not enough workforce. The mission I served in, the Florida Tallahassee mission, has closed, but they'll build a temple there. They've announced a temple for Tallahassee, closed the mission, and bought 2% of Florida as a commercial investment. The church used tithing money instead of saving the church and having a decent missionary program or something. They've spent hundreds of billions, you know, millions of dollars. They bought the biggest cattle ranch in Florida, and on that land, they're planning to build communities to house 500,000 people on something that will be under the water soon anyway, because the ice caps are melting. So it's very simple. Jesus said, if you want to know where someone's heart is, where's their money? The money is where your heart is. Their heart is in commercial property investment. And we see this in Britain, that the British members, you can look at the Charity Commission website in Britain. The church does this really interesting, very thorough financial declaration every year, and you can go and read it. For 5 years now, British people have donated over £4 million to the International Aid Fund. about $1 million to the Perpetual Education Fund, 350,000, something like that, to the Book of Mormon Fund. They're all still sitting there. Hardly a penny of those have been spent on the things that they were taken for. The church leadership in charge of this do not care about you. They do not care about losing people. They just want to hoard more money, and they will lie to you to get it from you. And they will tell you this money is being spent to help people in the third world get educated. It's not. It's sitting there earning interest in a bank account. They will tell you this money, we're first on the scene to help with international aid. But as I explore in some of the podcasts, there's so many egregious financial shenanigans going on. Welling Ward, my previous ward, has been around since 1841. The Woolwich branch was formed in 1841, and that's where most of Welling's members are. They still don't have a chapel because the church intentionally underbid repeatedly for land. And that's why one of our state presidency members left. That triggered him because he realized these people do not have integrity and they do not have our back. So we have to talk about that. This can't be a secret anymore. We just, if the only thing they respond to is public shame, shame them publicly. Because we cannot, this can't go on. It's totally intolerable. And it doesn't work because the church is plummeting. The active membership is falling fast. I'm sorry, I've gone off on a tangent there.
No, that's fine.
But yeah.
Got another question for you here. It says, are you saying that the teachings of Jesus Christ are that a marriage is ordained as being between a man and a woman is now not the case?
I'm not sure what that's about.
Yeah, let me repeat that. Are you saying that the teachings of Jesus Christ, that a marriage is ordained as being between a man and a woman, is now not the case?
Oh, I see. That would be, I think, a response to my statement that we have to become LGBTQ inclusive. Yeah. The first thing I would say in response to that is that wasn't Mormon doctrine for the first 50 years, was it? Brigham Young taught that the only way, and his successor, prophets, the only way to get into the celestial kingdom, or the highest degree of the celestial kingdom, was polygamous plural marriage. So that was our doctrine. That's what they did. Joseph Smith had 42 wives, including pretty much every teenage housemaid or foster daughter that ever entered his household. And, you know, we know the history. So to even begin having that conversation, people need to get real about the polygamy, and this whole one man, one wife thing is nonsense. And there are many other forms of marriage that the church has authorized. Joseph Smith was sealed to other men's wives, active Mormons serving missions. He got himself sealed to their wives for eternity, even though they were legally, lawfully, and church married to their wife. So that's called polyandry. So that's another form of marriage. Joseph Smith and other early Mormons married mother and daughter sets and siblings. We've done marriage kind of every configuration possible, except that, well, including same-sex ones, you could say, within the marriage between the people. So that have that reality check first before assuming that Mormonism cannot cope with another quite radical reconfiguration of what's acceptable as marriage. And if you want to go deep into that, there are lots of other sort of analyses of what does the Bible actually say. And just one interesting point, the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants say nothing anywhere about homosexuality. Nothing, just the Bible, which is interesting. Some people will say that's proof that Joseph Smith faked it because homosexuality somehow wasn't on his radar particularly, so he didn't have. If you have a real historical society, there will be gay people. It will get mentioned in the scriptures like it was throughout biblical history. So that's just another thought if you want to open that Pandora's box. There's nothing in the LDS scriptures about homosexuality. Interesting. Fun fact.
Thank you. Okay, next, Rob, this is the question, what do you love most about the LDS Church / Mormon doctrine?
I'd say what I love about the church is one of our amazing, unique selling points is we involve everyone in ministry. I think this is incredible. We had an open house during a sort of interfaith open house week a couple of years ago, and I was chatting to a Sikh lady, I think, and just talking about what we do as a church and how we organize ourselves. And this is something I really picked up in all my interactions with other Christians in the Bible Belt and also through Christian Union, that we rock. They just waste their people and their talents. You know, they'll pay a few people to be the ministering team, or those people will volunteer. They get to have all these interesting, growing leadership role experiences and minister. And the people just turn up and worship every week. And that's kind of it. And there's not much more. Such a waste, like ridiculous waste of all that talent. And Mormonism uses it. If you can breathe and you're willing, you've got a calling. And particularly where, as we experience in Britain, where we're not overrun with people, everyone gets to have an interesting calling. You know, I've done nearly all of them except the scary ones. So I'll wear a yellow jacket if it looks like I might be a bishop at some point, which I don't think is going to happen now. That's basically what this is all about. It's making sure I'm never going to be a bishop, but my brother is now, bless him. So that is like the amazing thing our church does. As part of this idea, we've all got the potential to become gods, for goodness sake. So start training people up. As far as doctrine goes, I've already mentioned several. We have a Heavenly Mother, Eve is a hero. We have an anti-racist scripture that's specifically designed for our age, and we should be rocking the world with, but we can never do that until our leaders apologize for the racism and stop pretending it didn't happen, like they just did in October General Conference. It's unbelievable. Idiots. And then I don't know, so much the idea that our potential is to become gods. I cannot deal with a God who would not want his actual children to be everything that he is. I mean, this is fundamental. If you're a parent, you don't just want your kids to become everything you are. You want them to become more. Like, what kind of a sick sadist makes children to just keep them like an ant farm and torture half of them? That's ridiculous. And this is something I really sort of encountered conceptually at college. Don't know where my book is. Yeah, here it is. Crisis of Moral Authority. So I had a job at university, which had a load of RE students there, stacking shelves in the library. And I came across this book by Don Cupid called Crisis of Moral Authority, who is a Cambridge theologian from the 60s. And he was one of these sort of revolutionary forward thinkers. And he basically dismantles the traditional Christian God, specifically the point that if God made everyone out of nothing, ex nihilo, God is ethically responsible for all of us, for our mistakes, for our sins, for the people who end up in hell. He's a sick sadist. He made people in order, knowing that one day he'd be throwing them around in vats of lava in outer darkness or whatever. And that destroys, in one swoop, destroys the traditional Christian God. They have no comeback from that, because of their idea that God has to predate the existence of his creations. And I was like, oh my gosh, this weird thing Joseph Smith taught that kind of didn't make much sense, that we are co-eternal with God, that somehow whatever our spirit or intelligence or life spark is, has just always been there. He didn't make it. There is no individual personal God responsible for that existence, because God is a career. It's not he, you know, there were gods before, or the universe, you know, that's just the way it is. That absolves God of that fundamental ethical responsibility for all of our sins and everything that's wrong in the world. We have the answer. It's still a bit weird. It's philosophical, you know, you have to kind of get your head around a few concepts. But we do in our theology. It's not all like, oh, Joseph Smith just plagiarized from the people around him. No, there is so much more to what he taught that goes far deeper, that we can rock the 21st century with, that we can win theological debates, you know. So I love that. This is why I'm a passionate Latter-day Saint. I'm not going to go and be another kind of Christian. They're really messed up. Their God's a sadist. I mean, my gosh, you know, I've seen what those people do or say. I mean, I know that sounds arrogant, and that's not how all other Christians feel. But, you know, in big picture nutshell, this is, for me, this is where the big ideas are at. But we're absolutely underselling them, and our leaders do not care. They don't even understand half of this doctrine. And Hugh Nibley warned us that this would happen in his famous speech to BYU Leaders versus Managers in the early 80s, I think. He said, you know, and he saw it coming, if you let the manager class take over the church, they will infiltrate everything and you will cease to flourish, just like happened to the Roman Empire. He said they're the lawyers, they're the business managers, and they care most about money. What have we got today? Most of our apostles have trained, nearly all the apostles, even Uchtdorf, trained in business management, which is about you're successful if you're making money and you can keep rejigging meeting schedules and reorganizing your workforce. That's success, you've won. Lawyers, Oakes and Cook and others, they just lie. They lie and lie and lie. They're telling so many lies. They're lying by withholding information. They're lying in what they say overtly, and they justify it to themselves. And several of their conference talks are like these long legal arguments justifying the indefensible. But they're not even very good at it, because they then contradict themselves and each other. But it's framed in this lawyer kind of language. And they're not, and what they're not is they're not literature students, they're not theology students. The stuff of religion is history, is culture, is the arts, is literature, which I think is why people like Patrick Mason and Terrell Givens have really struck a positive sort of vibe with Latter-day Saints, because they bring to their reconfiguration of Mormonism, and they are quite radically reconfiguring it, they bring that insight from history and culture and religion. They understand religion. Unfortunately, most of our apostles are not religious. They don't get religion. They get being functional, they get management, they get repeating what people said before, and they get exercising power and propaganda. And they think having a new logo is a triumph, and that is the great blessing God is going to give us in the modern age. It's not religion. So there's that needs to come back as well. We need to rediscover our actual theology and religion and love it and celebrate it. And that's kind of the strength that we can feed ourselves with. But what we're being fed is thin gruel, Sunday after Sunday, and each year the curriculum dumbs down further. It does not get more sophisticated by a long way. It's tragic, you know. And people leave. It's not like they're getting away with it. They're not getting away with it. People just get bored and go. So we can't keep doing that.
Unfortunately, I think some people would say that when you've got $100 billion in the bank, you're getting away with it.
Yeah, you're getting away with getting rich. They're fine, yeah. But they're not. But people aren't believing it anymore. People aren't joining the church. 3 seconds of Googling Mormons, they'll find out all about their hidden wealth and the lies they told about it, and the real history of the church and all of these scandals. So you know, it feels, if you're still active, it can really feel like it. But we've got this dynamic going on. And it's really hit in a lot of our wards that the people who are more informed, sparky, interested, forward-thinking, wanting to move the church forward are mostly the people who've gone, because they've banged their head against this wall over and over and over, and it won't budge, or they don't feel it will, or it's budging too slowly, or it's just demoralizing, like they're getting no feedback of positivity. And I think what has really helped people who are still trying is the internet. You can find the other people still fighting that battle. There are amazing support groups online to just validate you. You're not the crazy one. Yes, that's exactly what I'm experiencing. Gospel Doctrine was a car crash. What do we do about this? And at least here you can talk freely and lament and receive comfort and go back and fight again. But what that means then is again, we're running out of time, because increasingly the people who are left are those who are least interested or equipped for being the urgent change that has to happen, because those people went. I mean, we had, you know, some amazing, sparky, intensely ideological young single adults who were nurtured by an amazing missionary couple, giving them lots of time and investing and having these interesting conversations about Mormon theology with them that just switched them on, like I was at their age. They're gone. It's just boring. Boring. And obviously it's been hard for wards with COVID. I really feel, obviously, for the local leaders, it's been hard to kind of maintain any kind of momentum, and you can't have the informal chats anymore. It's so difficult if you're doing Zoom lessons and things. So, you know, that's just a tragedy. You know, no one's responsible for that. But in the larger picture, the people who are left think we have to keep it safe and that will protect the church, but they just won't notice that it hasn't worked. But they panic and tighten up more and more, which is the Pharisee approach. You control people through ritual and habits and mind control, not actually engage with their real needs. So that is a self-defeating spiral, and it gets harder and harder. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, here's an interesting question then that kind of links onto this. So for myself, I left the church a few years ago now, and I think listening to some of the things that you say, you know, is the closest that I've come to someone where I guess I could kind of say almost, thou makest me a Mormon again. And
can I, sorry to interrupt, can I just say, I get that a lot. And this is what the local leaders don't get. And I've tried, you know, I've had conversations with my stake president and others over the years in different places, like trying to communicate that, like, you don't understand. There's this whole world that they're not going to talk to you because they don't kind of trust the authority system, or when they tried, they didn't get a good reception or whatever. But there are all these people who are either about to leave and you have no idea they're about to go, but when they go, it's permanent, they're not coming back. Or you've got these people, multitudes who've left, who are yearning still. If the church could just actually do a bit better at living up to its own principles and not be this bad. It's a spectrum, and we've got really bad. We're robbing people. We're just lying to them, like, shamelessly. It doesn't have to, you know, it doesn't have to be perfect, but let's get the dial back to, like, over here near Jesus somewhere. You know, we'll never get rid of Pharisaism completely, but we don't have to be over here. And that's the battle. And each time it moves that way, we lose more people. Sorry, carry on. But
so here's the question.
How many
then,
people say that to me? They really do. It's a lifeline.
So the question that I've got here then is, why exactly would Mormons who left come back? Would they need a new agenda and formally present it? So for those people that have gone, why would they come back?
It would. Every time I do a presentation about the great things about Mormonism, theologically, the community we can offer when we're doing it right, they say to me afterwards, you've just reminded me why I love this religion. You know, they feel that pull. It's like a magnet, because they love that. They were living it. They're not aliens. They've been Mormon. They understand it all. And it's just that was never talked about, or it became the least important thing to their ward, to their leaders, from what they were hearing in general conference. So I think if we can fire up again with our unique selling points as a community, as an opportunity to serve, but we are going to have these changes happen. And whether people find it mind-blowing that we would have gay people getting married in the temple, we've done weirder stuff, like learn the history. We've really done very, very, very much weirder stuff than that for decades. We were institutionally racist. My parents grew up, well, my dad did, grew up in a church where black people couldn't have the priesthood. We've done some crazy stuff and somehow carried on. You can cope. You can cope with these changes. We've given up, we made polygamy everything and then abandoned it. You know, we can do these switcheroos. We can find a way to make it work for you. So if we can make those changes that have to happen, and if we don't, we'll be destroyed. So it's the only option. Then we have, the mindset has to be not the people who left were lazy, they were sinful, they weren't strong enough. All of that is nonsense. And Elder Uchtdorf gave an amazing talk about that, saying, you know, this isn't the case. People often have good reason for leaving. Sometimes our leaders have done and said things that are not in harmony with our gospel. He said that, which is why, of course, the Pharisees kicked him out of the first presidency, because he's embarrassing them. They're pretending none of that happened. And it's, you know, it's a complete opposite religion. So if we could just be honest about that, if we can, we have to earn, we have to deserve to have our children stay. We have to deserve the less active to return. And we don't deserve it. We have tolerated corruption on an epic scale. We have normalized Lucifer's plan of salvation through unthinking, unconditional obedience to very flawed human leaders to become our religion that gets taught in General Conference. I mean, that's that we're not offering the Church of Jesus Christ to come back to. They've taken it with them. Their integrity to the values of the restoration of Christianity, of the return of the fullness of the gospel. They had to take it with them and leave because it wasn't safe on a pew in a Mormon chapel. That's insane, but that is what's happened. And we just have to recognize that, repent, make radical reforms, and then beg them to return and prove to them that we've repented and changed. But our first presidency insists that they will never apologize for anything. The Dallin Oaks refuses to acknowledge ever, if you observe carefully, all this stuff about even defending God being racist is fundamentally that he cannot allow anyone to think for a moment that the leaders of the church could be wrong about anything. And in holding that, he's breaking everything else. And, you know, so unfortunately, the conclusion is radical change has to happen there. Why are we putting these poor old men with no support from common consent scrutiny to run an international church until they die? It's just cruelty. Let's at least have emeritus status when they're like past 70 or something. Our religion was created by young people in their 20s and 30s who cranked out scripture like confetti machines, who were revolutionary, who were forward-thinking, and they created a religious revolution. The idea that age brings wisdom in our church is nonsense, because it clearly doesn't. They just look backwards. That's where they feel safe. As they slip into dementia, the thing they remember most clearly is their young adulthood. That when things were certain, when they're at Fowler stage 3, because they're young adults, they think they've worked it all out. For President Nelson, that was the 1940s. And for most of the rest of them, the 1950s. So it's not surprising that we're going back to middle-class Utah 1950s ideas of what the ideal family is, which is actually a very temporary construct of that particular time. Women used to work. You know, the idea of women staying home is a short middle-class post-war fantasy in wealthy countries. Women have always worked for money. You know, so what they've turned into God's way of doing everything, which they teach over and over again in the face-to-faces and all the messaging to the young people, is delusional and not helpful. So unfortunately, we have to find a way to preserve our religion, where if that's what they're choosing to say and do, that can't be what we believe or think is the religion, because it isn't, and it's destroying the church. So I am calling, in a sense, for rebellion, for revolution, but and as all rebels do, in the name of the true religion, which can sound very arrogant, and you just have to be the judge of that. I may be totally wrong, but look at the evidence and then decide. And I'm presenting the evidence in these podcasts.
I'm really sorry to do this because we've got so many questions still.
I'm so sorry. If people have written them, I'm happy to do written responses and things.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. I'm aware that it's a school night and you all need to get off bed to get a good night's sleep. There is one that I do want to finish with, though, that I think kind of relates to a few of the others. Which is, have you ever thought of starting a break-off, Peter?
Yeah.
Is that what this is all about, really? Have you ever thought of starting your own church?
I'm the new Denver snuffer. Absolutely not. And that, in a way, is why I'm so motivated and excited, because what really became clear, the more I talked to the people who'd left and about why they left, and the more I looked at what we've got and what the solutions have to be, we've had them all along. Such a relief. We don't have to start a new church or sort of a revolution. We just need to do our one right. The Doctrine and Covenants is incredibly clear about how power should work in our church. And Dallin Oakes knows it, which is why he very carefully totally misquoted it in his March 2020 Ensign article, trying to sell the idea that if the 15 apostles agree that something is doctrine, that makes it doctrine. But he very carefully jumped over all the scriptures that taught the opposite. And then he tried to tack on something about common consent at the end of that article that made no sense. He's not a good lawyer. Read it for yourself, March 2020, and what the Doctrine and Covenants actually says is, and Joseph Smith did leave confusion about succession. Some people thought, oh, it's going to be the first presidency. Sidney Rigdon thought he should rule. Other people thought his children were going to be the next prophet. But what is actually being canonized is actually quite clear. There are the leading quorums of the church with exactly equal authority are the first presidency, the quorum of 12 apostles, the first quorum of 70, and the stake high councils. Now, at the time, they only had sort of 2 or 3 stakes. And ultimately, the church was mostly run by the first presidency and the high councils. The 12 apostles were kind of traveling missionaries without like a power base particularly. And it says that if all the 70 vote unanimously on something, they have equal authority to the first presidency or the 12. If the stake high councils vote unanimously, they also have equal authority. They can discipline each other. They can release each other. There is that balance of power. The leadership have tried to sell this idea that our church is a theocratic dictatorship. It is absolutely not. It is a democracy. And then, even if they all agree on something, nothing can become the church's policy or doctrine without the whole church, all of the members, being invited to vote on it in a common consent vote, and the majority wins. And they did this for the first few years of the church. There was a moment when Joseph Smith wanted to get rid of Sidney Rigdon from the first presidency because he was quite mentally ill and a bit flaky, but the people loved him. They had a conference. Joseph Smith gave his case, Sidney Rigdon spoke for himself, other people presented ideas, and then they voted. And the majority of the people voted to keep Sidney Rigdon, so Joseph Smith respected that, because that's the law of common consent. He made the effort to reconcile with Sidney, and they had several more years of productive working relationship. Where this changed was in winter quarters. So in this vague sort of transition cocoon period for the church before they arrived in Utah, Brigham Young used his power base as president of the 12 to move decisively and take over. He released the 70 and stake high councils, kind of reshuffled the people into the opposite quorums to break their institutional loyalty, and he established the idea that everything in the church is done by the 15. We now, since then, have a situation where they don't even vote in common consent for the prophet before he's set apart. So technically, President Nelson isn't even the president of the church. Our culture in the church that's so finicky about authority and keys. President Nelson went into the Salt Lake Temple. They've already decided they're not going to seek revelation about who should be the next person. It's always the next prophet will be whoever the longest serving apostle is, with continual service. He released President Uchtdorf. They ordained him and Oakes and Eyring as the new first presidency. 2 days later, they held a press conference and announced it to the church and started functioning. They did everything that our first presidency does. The members of the church did not vote to sustain this until 3 months later in General Conference, when they did a pretend solemn assembly and they had each of the quorums get up and vote and all the membership. Why didn't that happen before they were set apart? We wouldn't do that with the stake president. We wouldn't do that with the bishop. We wouldn't do that with the deacon. How is it we don't notice this? I mean, this is how bad it's got. They're not. He will cause upheaval in the church because of one verse in the Doctrine and Covenants to do with the name of the church. Throw Presidents Hinckley and Monson and all of us under the bus as giving a victory to Satan because we got involved in the I'm a Mormon campaign. But he's completely ignoring all the scriptures about his own calling, that the scriptures say nobody should have any calling in this church without first being sustained by the common consent votes of the membership. No calling, including his own. But they just completely ignore it and give us guilt trips about any little finicky thing we're not doing right. And we need to take the sacrament with our right hand and only have one pair of earrings. It's the Pharisee religion. They're playing a blinder. So either we carry on just tolerating this, or when is the point surely to stop tolerating it and actually do things like we're meant to, as our church, not a new church, do what we're meant to, following our own constitution is now, because if we don't, there will be no church in Europe in 15 or 20 years. So if it's not going to happen now, chaps, everyone in Europe and lots of the rest of the world, it's never going to happen. I'll see you in 15 years as we close our last chapel. That's your choice. And that's what I'm saying. Think about it for yourself.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peter. You've been brilliant. It's been lovely having you here.
Thank you.
Hopefully we'll get another opportunity to have a conversation like this. Apologies to those people who we didn't get to your questions, although a lot of them were kind of answered with things that you were saying anyway. Peter, if you're okay to kind of go on the...
I'll be very happy to, yeah.
Yeah, I think that'd be wonderful. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so that just leaves it for me, again, to thank everybody that's come. Thank you for taking part in this. If you haven't already, then go on to the Sunstone UK Facebook page, join the group there. We've also got a Sunstone UK discussions group, which is a closed group, but it's a place where we can talk a little bit more openly in one of these forums that is so needed in the church. And the only other thing I would say is just keep your ear to the ground. We've got some wonderful things planned. We're still really hopeful that at some point this year we'll be able to have an in-person event where we can all get together and discuss those things. Peter, I'm sure you'll be there, won't you? And yeah, he's nodding. Yeah, and hope to see you all there.
Sorry, I was just muting for my wife's sneeze.
Okay, brilliant. Bless you.
Thank you. Bless you, darling. Yeah,
fantastic.
Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate your patience and time, and I hope some of that was helpful. And ultimately, while being, how I was raised in the church, critical analysis, we can do better, but love it. This religion's amazing. We're here to be a world religion, but we can't do it this way. It's not happening. So let's get back to being a world religion again. We can do this, but the reforms have to happen first.
Brilliant. Thank you, Peter. I'll let you have the last word then. Brilliant. Have a good night.
You too. Take care. Thank you.